Somewhere in your city, right now, a man is walking into a bank. He looks ordinary. No suit, no entourage, no visible sign that anything about him is different. He walks up to the same teller counter you've stood at. He hands over a similar-looking form. And then, something happens that most people in that building will never notice. Someone comes out from behind a closed door, not a teller, not a regular manager, a different person entirely. They greet him by name. They take him to a private room. And from that point forward, everything about his banking experience is completely different from yours. You've probably never seen this happen. That's not an accident. There is a tier of banking that exists in plain sight, hidden not by secrecy, but by silence. No advertisement, no promotional flyer in the lobby, no email campaign inviting you to apply. It doesn't work that way. You don't find it, it finds you, or more precisely, your money does. And the number that unlocks this invisible door is not $1 million. It's not even close to what most people assume. The threshold that separates two entirely different financial realities is smaller than you think. And what's waiting on the other side of that number will change the way you understand money, banks, and the entire system you've been operating inside your whole life. We're going to go deep today. Not surface-level deep, not here are 5 tips deep. We're going to follow the money, trace the system, and expose why banks behave like an entirely different institution depending on who's sitting across the table. By the time this is over, you'll understand why everything you've been told about banking is technically true and fundamentally incomplete. There are 3 things specifically that shift after you cross this threshold. The third one is the one that almost nobody talks about, and it may be the most important thing you learn today. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand why this system exists, you need to understand what a bank actually is. And I don't mean the definition you memorized in school. Most people think of a bank as a place to store money, a safe, essentially. You put your money in, you take it out when you need it, and occasionally you earn a little interest. That's the story, that's the surface. But here's what's actually happening. When you deposit money into a bank, that money is no longer yours in the traditional sense. You become a creditor. The bank owes you that money, and the bank takes that money, your money, and uses it to generate returns. They lend it to other customers at higher interest rates. They invest it. They leverage it. Your $100 becomes the foundation for several $100s of lending activity. The bank earns on your money. You earn next to nothing in return. This is not a conspiracy. It's not illegal. It's simply how fractional reserve banking works. And in this system, not all depositors are equal. Not because of any moral judgment. Not because the bank likes some people more. But because of one pure, cold, mathematical reality. The amount of money you keep in a bank directly determines how valuable you are to that institution. A customer with $2,000 in savings is an operational cost. A customer with $200,000 is a revenue opportunity. These are not the same thing, and the bank treats them accordingly. Now here's where it gets interesting, because most people know at some level that wealthy people get better treatment from banks. But almost everyone assumes the dividing line is somewhere in the distant future. $1 million, 10 million, something far away and almost mythical. The reality is the threshold comes far earlier than that, and it comes with a set of changes that are so dramatic, so systemic, that it almost feels like you've been invited into a different institution operating inside the same building. The number varies slightly depending on the bank and the country, but in the American banking system, the psychological and operational shift begins around $100,000. Some banks set it at $50,000, some at $250,000. But $100,000 is the number most commonly cited by former private bankers, wealth managers, and financial industry insiders as the first real inflection point. It's the number where the bank starts to see you differently, not as a retail customer, not as a depositor, but as a relationship. And that word, relationship, is everything. Because what changes after $100,000 is not just the features. It's not just the perks. What changes is the fundamental philosophy of how the bank interacts with you. Retail banking, the kind most people experience, is transactional. You need something. You initiate. You wait. You receive. The bank is essentially passive. It provides a service on demand. But above a certain threshold, banking becomes relational. The bank becomes proactive. Instead of waiting for you to come to them, they come to you. Instead of responding to problems, they anticipate them. Instead of offering standard products, they structure solutions specifically around your situation. This sounds like customer service. It is not customer service. It is something more calculated, more strategic, and more consequential than that. Let me tell you about what happens inside the walls of what banks call their private client divisions or their wealth management tiers. These are real departments with real staff, real resources, and real mandates, and their existence is funded entirely by the profitable management of clients who have crossed certain asset thresholds. The people who work in these divisions are not tellers with extra training. They are specialists. Some have backgrounds in law, tax, estate planning, corporate finance. They are paid significantly more than retail bank employees. And they carry something retail staff does not. They carry a small number of client relationships, sometimes as few as 50 or 75, which means they actually know your situation. Here is something that almost nobody thinks to ask. When you call your bank today, who answers? Someone in a call center. Probably a different person than the last time. Someone reading from a screen, following a script, who does not know your name before you say it, and will not remember it after you hang up. That is retail banking. Now consider this. Some bank customers have a direct mobile number for a single dedicated individual. That individual knows their financial history, knows their family situation, knows their business, knows their goals. And when they call, that person picks up. Not a call center, not a queue. A human being who is professionally invested in that specific relationship. This is not a fantasy. This is the daily reality of banking above the threshold. And it exists, in part, because it has to. Because the products and instruments available above certain asset levels are genuinely complex. Certificates of deposit, standard savings accounts, and auto loans are simple. They can be processed by software, managed by scripts, scaled to millions of customers. But structured investment products, trust arrangements, family-limited partnerships, tax-optimized credit facilities, estate coordination, those are not simple. They require human expertise. And that expertise is expensive, which is why it's reserved for the clients who can justify the cost. But this is where everything changes. Because what you might assume is that the difference between retail banking and private banking is just access to fancier products, better interest rates, a nicer waiting room. And if that's what you think, you're missing the most important part of this entire story. The part that genuinely separates not just banking tiers, but financial trajectories. The part that explains why the wealthy stay wealthy and why everyone else runs in place. It's not the products. It's the information asymmetry. Here is a reality that is uncomfortable, but true. Financial institutions possess knowledge that they are not obligated to share with you unless you have a certain level of assets. Not illegal knowledge, not secret schemes. Just specialized, contextual, high-value information about instruments. Strategies and timing that is never packaged into a retail product and never explained in a branch brochure. This information exists. It circulates. It is acted on every single day. But it circulates inside a specific layer of the financial ecosystem, and access to that layer is gated by assets. Consider something as straightforward as interest rates. You probably know that savings accounts pay almost nothing. Even high-yield savings accounts online often pay between 4 and 5%, which feels generous until you account for inflation and taxes. Now here's what you probably don't know. There are instruments available to clients above certain thresholds that are structured entirely differently. Negotiated rates, tiered arrangements, products that are not listed anywhere publicly because they're not sold to the public. They're offered, privately, to specific clients, by specific advisors, based on a relationship or consider loans. Most people think of a loan as something you apply for. You submit documents, you wait for approval, you receive a decision that is largely algorithmic. Your credit score, your income, your debt-to-income ratio. The bank runs a calculation and spits out a number. That's retail lending. But above the threshold, lending works differently. Credit facilities are structured around assets, not income. If you have $500,000 in a managed account with a bank, you can often borrow against that portfolio at rates far below what any retail customer could access without selling a single share, without triggering a taxable event, without disrupting your investment position at all. This is called securities-backed lending, and it is one of the most powerful mechanisms used by people with significant wealth to maintain liquidity without sacrificing compounding growth. Most people have never heard of it. Most people will never be offered it. Not because they couldn't use it, but because their balance doesn't justify the conversation. This is not the bank being evil. This is the bank being rational. And understanding this rationality is the first step toward navigating it. Let's pull back even further now. Because to really understand why all of this works the way it does, you need to understand something about the psychology of money that goes far beyond banking. You need to understand the concept of financial leverage. Not leverage in the technical sense of using debt. Leverage in the philosophical sense. The idea that resources, when positioned correctly, generate more resources. That money, when it reaches a certain mass, starts to behave differently. It starts to attract things, opportunities, relationships, information, terms. There's a threshold effect in almost every complex system. Water stays liquid right up until the moment it freezes, and then the change is sudden and total. Chemistry works this way. Biology works this way, and wealth, it turns out, works this way too. Below a certain level, money is purely consumptive. You earn it, you spend it, you have some left over, you save it, and it sits there earning almost nothing while inflation quietly erodes it. This is the financial reality of the majority of working adults in every developed country on Earth. Money as a tool of survival and comfort, but not as a generator of more money. Above a certain level, money becomes generative. It starts to attract returns that compound. It qualifies you for instruments that protect it from taxes. It gives you access to information that lets you deploy it more intelligently. And it changes the way institutions perceive you, which changes the terms on which they deal with you, which compounds the advantage further. This is the threshold effect in personal finance. And the $100,000 mark, while not the ultimate destination, is where the early signs of this shift begin to appear. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision matters. $100,000 doesn't transform your life. It's not a magic number. Someone with $100,000 sitting in a basic savings account at a megabank is not automatically invited into any private tier. The threshold is about total relationship value. Total assets under management with that institution. Total investable assets that the bank can see, structure, and profit from. The number is less important than the signal it sends. The signal that this is a person whose financial life is growing, whose needs will become more complex, whose potential lifetime value to the institution is significant. Banks, like all businesses, are investing in future revenue, and a client at $100,000 who is still growing looks very different from a client at $100,000 who has been there for 20 years with no movement. This is also why the conversation has to include behavior, not just balance. Because one of the most underappreciated facts about private banking is that the clients who get the most value from it are not just the ones with the most money. They're the ones who communicate, who engage, who ask questions, who treat the relationship like a relationship rather than a transaction. Banks are run by humans, and humans respond to engagement. A client who calls their advisor to discuss a major financial decision, who asks about options before acting, who gives the institution an opportunity to provide value, that client receives materially different treatment than one who simply parks money and disappears. This insight alone is worth remembering, because it means the transition to a different kind of banking relationship is not purely a function of net worth. It's partly a function of behavior. It's partly about positioning yourself as the kind of client the institution wants to serve. Let's talk about the third shift. Because we said at the beginning there are three things that change after you cross this threshold. We've touched on the first two: the shift in how the bank interacts with you, and the shift in what information and instruments you have access to. The third one is the one that has the longest reach, the most lasting impact, and the one that is almost never discussed in personal finance content anywhere. The third shift is about protection. Here's something most people never think about when they think about their bank. Financial institutions are not just service providers. They are, in many cases, the most sophisticated risk management entities your money will ever encounter. And the way they manage risk is not uniform across all customers. At the retail level, risk management is essentially standardized. Your account has FDIC insurance up to $250,000. Your transactions have fraud monitoring that is algorithm-based. If something goes wrong, there's a process. You file a report, you wait. There's a resolution timeline. It's functional, it's impersonal, and it is adequate for most situations involving small amounts of money. At the private banking level, risk management is personalized, proactive, and extraordinarily more sophisticated. Dedicated clients in wealth tiers have real human beings whose literal job responsibility includes monitoring for anomalies in their financial activity. Not algorithms, not automated flags. Actual people who know the client's pattern well enough to notice when something doesn't look right. There are documented cases of private banking clients being called by their advisors before they even noticed fraudulent activity themselves, because someone was paying attention. Because the relationship creates a level of familiarity that automation simply cannot replicate. But protection extends beyond fraud. It extends to legal structure, to tax efficiency, to estate planning. When you have meaningful assets, the way those assets are held becomes enormously important. Assets in your personal name are exposed to lawsuits, to estate taxes, to creditors. Assets held in properly structured legal entities, trusts, family limited partnerships, certain types of accounts are shielded, not hidden, not illegally sheltered, legitimately protected by structures that exist precisely for this purpose and have existed in law for generations. The people who know about these structures, who understand which to use and when, are not commonly employed at the retail banking level. They exist in the private banking and wealth management world, and their clients benefit from strategies that are technically available to everyone, but practically available only to those within their orbit. This is the silent advantage, the asymmetry that compounds over time. Not just the extra interest rate, not just the nicer experience, the compounding, multi-generational, structurally embedded advantage of being in a different category entirely. One where the institution is invested in your financial success because your success means their success. Let's bring this home now. Because everything we've talked about so far has been structural, systemic, about the architecture of a financial world you may not yet have full access to. But the question that actually matters is what to do with this information. Because understanding that a different tier exists is only useful if it changes something about how you think and act. The first thing to change is your timeline and your target. If you didn't know that $100,000 represented a real inflection point in how institutions perceive you, you may have treated savings as a vague, abstract goal, something to accumulate slowly without particular urgency. With this context, $100,000 becomes a strategic objective with real specific rewards on the other side. Not just psychological satisfaction, not just a sense of security, but a genuine, documented shift in your relationship with the financial system. That changes the psychology of accumulation. It gives the number meaning beyond the number itself. The second thing to change is where you're accumulating. Because many people spread assets across multiple institutions, which means no single institution ever sees the full picture. And the full picture is what triggers the relationship shift. $50,000 at Bank A and $50,000 at Bank B doesn't get you what $100,000 at one institution does. Consolidation, while it feels counterintuitive to people who've been taught to diversify, can actually be strategically valuable in the early stages of wealth building precisely because it accelerates the relationship threshold you hit. Once you're in the private tier, the institution has deeper knowledge of your situation, and you can absolutely diversify from there with full strategic support. But getting there often requires concentration first. The third thing to change is how you present yourself. Banking is a relationship business at higher tiers, which means communication matters. Asking intelligent questions matters. Letting your bank know about your financial goals, your timelines, your business activities matters because it signals sophistication. It signals growth trajectory. And it signals to the people who manage these relationships that this is a client worth investing in. You don't need to perform wealth you don't have, but you do need to behave like someone who is building something intentionally. Because that is what the private banking relationship is designed to serve. There is something poetic and a little unsettling about the fact that the financial system is most helpful to the people who need it least. That the best advice, the most favorable terms, the most sophisticated protection is all concentrated on the upper end of the asset distribution. This is not an accident of poor design. It is a logical consequence of a profit-driven system allocating its best resources to its most valuable clients. You can be frustrated by this. Many people are. But frustration without strategic response is just noise. The response that actually matters is to understand the system deeply enough to navigate it, to know where the thresholds are, to know what changes when you cross them, to make the decisions that move you from one tier to the next. Not because you're gaming anything, not because you've found a loophole, but because you now understand the terrain. There is a line that separates two completely different financial experiences, and most people spend their entire lives without knowing exactly where it is or what it means. They feel the difference, vaguely, in the sense that wealthy people seem to have access to things they don't. But they can't name it, can't quantify it, can't aim at it. Now you can. The man who walked into the bank at the start of this story didn't get pulled into that private room because of luck. He didn't get there because the system was rigged in his favor from birth. He got there because at some point he understood what we've spent the last 20 minutes discussing. He understood that money has tiers, that institutions have tiers, that relationships have tiers, and that the path from one tier to the next is navigable if you know what you're navigating toward. The silence around this tier is not accidental. The people inside it have no incentive to broadcast its existence. The institutions that operate it have no incentive to advertise it to people who haven't qualified yet. And so most people never know. They use the bank the way they always have. They earn a little interest. They pay their fees. They call the call center. And somewhere in the same building, through a door they never noticed, a completely different conversation is happening. Now you know that door exists. That's not a small thing. That might be the most financially important thing you've heard in a very long time. If this changed the way you think about money and the systems around it, you know what to do. There's a lot more where this came from.